Good evening. I'm Paolo Carrozza, the director of the Kellogg Institute of International Studies here at Notre Dame. And on behalf of the Kellogg Institute and the Keough School of Global Affairs, I want to welcome you to this wonderful event. I have the privilege of introducing to you our guest tonight, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. The basic outlines of Professor Sachs's biography, in fact, probably are well known to you. I will rehearse them anyway. He's a professor of economics, leader in sustainable development, a senior United Nations advisor, and a best-selling author. Twice, Professor Sachs was named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and he's widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts on economic development and the fight against global poverty. He's the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he's the Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development and a Professor of Health Policy and Management, and serves separately as a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the Millennium Development Goals. Professor Sachs directs the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's the co-founder and chief strategist of the Millennium Promise Alliance and director of the Millennium Villages Project. He is also one of the Secretary General's advocates for the Millennium Development Goals. His work generally on ending poverty, promoting economic growth, fighting hunger and disease, and promoting sustainable environmental practices has taken him around the world to more than 125 countries, where he's advised dozens of world leaders and worked closely with many international organizations. Professor Sachs is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received more than 20 honorary doctorates and many other awards and honors from around the world. And yet, despite the familiarity and really extraordinary nature of this little biography, in fact, here at Notre Dame, I think it doesn't begin to capture why he is such a fascinating individual for us to be engaged with tonight, given who we are at this university. Because beyond the formalities of his biography, it can also be said that Professor Sachs clearly is one of the leaders in thinking about the role of the university in tackling global problems, exactly what we care about so deeply here in trying to start the Keough School. He has built bridges across disciplines. He has treated economics and development the way that a medical doctor would treat a patient as a clinical practice in trying to determine what is needed in order to restore health to individuals and their communities. In all of these ways, and throughout all of this, he's paid a special attention to the role of moral values and principles in economics, and in particular to the place that religion plays in the development of human communities and the solutions to the gravest of the human problems of the world. And in all of these ways, he commends himself to our community here at Notre Dame in a very special way. He is, one could say, an embodiment of our aspirations to seek integral human development. And perhaps the best way of expressing this is by simply reading to you a few of his own words. Professor Sachs has noted that, quote, in its quest for scientific rigor, mainstream economics long ago shed its traditional interest in a moral framework. A profession that started out as a field of moral inquiry had by the 20th century become a cheerleader for egoistic materialism, with little or no concern for moral inquiry. Human well-being, once a central interest of the moral philosophy of classical economics, in the hands of 20th century economics, has become virtually synonymous with one's purchases and possessions. There have been disastrous consequences of the globalization of indifference. At this stage of history, he continues, humanity is at a crossroads. With the future course of our own choosing, we have the technical means to solve our national and global problems, to banish poverty, fight disease, protect the environment, and train the illiterate and unskilled. But we can and will do so only if we care enough to mount the effort. We face a moral crisis, much more than a financial or economic crisis. And for this reason, we must offer, says Professor Sachs, our gratitude to Pope Francis, for he has lovingly reminded us that our highest aspirations really are within our grasp. So Professor Sachs here this evening is here to remind us of our moral aspirations and the way that reaching them are indeed within our grasp. So please join me in giving him a very warm Notre Dame welcome.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thanks so much. Thank you. Paolo, thank you. That was really wonderful, and also all of you very, very warm on a very cold night, I might add. But we're warming up fast, and I want to thank you for coming out this evening to think together and indeed about these very important issues. I couldn't be more delighted than I am to be with you at Notre Dame and with the Kellogg Institute and with all of the fervor and commitment that it represents and that this university represents. We have a lot of work to do together, and I want to describe this evening briefly what some of that work is and why 2015, this year, is a remarkable year for our efforts. It's a year we can't let just slip by. It's an unusual year because it's a year of high diplomacy that can make a great difference. But if we miss the year, we're also going to learn, sadly, that the opportunity is not going to come back again very soon. So I want to talk about this challenge in the context or the framework of sustainable development, which I have found to be a very powerful organizing principle, but I have to say, thank goodness it's not my view, but rather the views of the member states of the United Nations who are intent on making sustainable development the organizing principle for the coming period of global development efforts, the next 15 years. And this is the year that they've promised to set us on a new course, and I want to describe what that's about and what we can do this year to help nudge that forward. And if we come out of 2015 with a good progress, what we're going to have to do in hard work for the next 15 years actually to realize the potential and the need that we face. We are in a new period in history, and indeed the geologists tell us we're actually in a new epoch. And they mean this in a literal geological sense, that humanity has put Earth into an unprecedented new phase. So geologists date periods on the planet as epochs, and we are traditionally defined as being in the Holocene. This is the epoch that followed the last ice age. That was the period called the Pleistocene, and civilization flourished beginning with the new age, the Holocene. And what the geologists are telling us is the Holocene, as we knew it, is actually coming to an end now. Because by all standards of marking periods of Earth history, we're entering a new phase, something extraordinary. And they've given it the name, especially coined and popularized by Paul Crutzen, the Nobel laureate who was one of the 3 scientists who discovered the ozone depletion effect. He has called it the Anthropocene, which you can see from the Greek roots means the human epoch. And what he means by this, and what the geology profession now means seriously by this, not metaphorically, but literally, is not something good, look at how great we are, the anthropos, but look at how humanity is reshaping the planetary systems in a fundamental way. The Anthropocene means the human-driven Earth, where humanity, through its scale, its size, its economic productivity, its use of primary resources on the planet, whether it's the fossil fuels or water or land or the biota through fishing or hunting or raising livestock, is fundamentally changing the Earth's systems, the chemistry of the Earth, the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the biodiversity on the planet. And the term is not meant in a happy way. It's meant as a warning. It's a warning we've not yet heard, but it is a stark statement that the scale of human activity is so great that we are imperiling millions of species and the survival of millions or billions of humanity. Some in the darkest moments say our very survival as a species. Others say, rather, that we are courting disaster for a lot of humanity and for future generations unless we straighten out. So what is this Anthropocene? Where did it come from? And as I say on the slide, it's all about scale. It's about scale of the human enterprise. The fact that in the recent 2 centuries, the scale of human activity has reached startling proportions. It's been a huge success in many ways, but it is a huge imperilment at the same time. And it started with this, probably the most consequential invention, single invention in all of human history. Who can identify it, by the way? What student knows what that is? Any guesses? Yep. Steam engine. That's James Watt's 1781 steam engine. And I would say in human history, no single invention rivaled the impact that the steam engine did. It opened up the modern world. It opened up the modern economy. It made possible modern economic growth. It did something that was unimaginable up to the 18th century. It actually started about 70 years before Watt with Thomas Newcomen, who created the first commercial steam engine in 1712. It opened up a new energy source, an energy source so vast that it allowed a completely new form of civilization, the industrial world, to take hold. Before the steam engine, all energy that we had available was what we could produce through human action or what our animals fed by agriculture could produce through animal traction, or a little bit of wind power, mainly for sail, or for a few windmills, or a few water mills, and that was the extent of our ability to mobilize energy. But with the steam engine, we came to discover over 2 centuries that the vast store of solar power in the form of coal, oil, and gas sequestered organic matter from 100 million years ago made possible an explosion of economic activity that was completely unprecedented in human history. And it is striking. Probably the greatest political economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, wrote a famous essay in 1930 where he noted, among other things, that if a peasant from the Roman Empire had come back to England in 1700, he would have felt pretty much at home. Same subsistence agriculture, same rural economy, roughly the same living standards. Not too much had changed over the course of 1700 years. Then along came James Watt, and as they say, the rest is history. This is what macro historians have estimated to be the path of world output. And what you see here is world output in the Common Era from 1 AD onward, estimated by Angus Maddison, late great macro historian, who built up global accounts of economic activity over the course of 2 millennia, you see something happened 2 centuries ago. We were operating with subsistence agriculture, 90% of the world peasant farmers, up until as late as 1800. The world was poor. The world was very slowly changing. The size of industry was minuscule, because to make iron products or other transformations required so much energy, you had to basically cut down the forests for a little metallurgy until steam from coal came along. And then the global output shoots straight up. And this is the estimate also at Madison. If you divide the total output produced year by year worldwide, according to these estimates, by the estimate of world population, you get the output per person, which is at least to a very, very rough approximation, a measure of material life. And what this shows is the same thing. From the time of the Roman Empire up until 1800, there was not a discernible change in the standard of life around the world. Of course, there were advances in civilization. There was the Renaissance. There were all of the great events of the Enlightenment. But the material life remained subsistence agriculture and poor. And the French Revolution, you'll recall, was caused in part by a few bad harvests and a lot of very hungry people in one of supposedly the richest places in the world, but demonstrating that people were living at the edge of survival, even in Western Europe in 1789. And so then the curve takes off with the industrial era. And this is what population looks like. All curves look the same. There was a very, very gradual change of population, maybe from around 400 million people at the time of the Roman Empire, adding across China, Europe, small populations in the Americas, to perhaps 800 million people at the end of the 18th century. And now an order of magnitude increase. Why? What fundamentally changed? What fundamentally changed was the wave of technology that made it possible, among other things, to feed 10 times the population that had been fed before. And indeed, the most famous book ever written on population by Thomas Robert Malthus in 1798, The Principles of Population, was written at a time when the world population was around 900 million people. And that was roughly an eighth of what we have today. Malthus said that population was limited by the capacity to grow food, but with the steam engine, and then with the birth of modern chemistry, and then with the discovery that at least one great historian, Václav Smil, has called the most important discovery, most momentous discovery of the 20th century, something that almost no one's heard of, the Haber-Bosch process, which was the invention of taking nitrogen out of the air and making nitrogen-based fertilizer. All of a sudden, the capacity to grow food was unprecedented, and the human population has soared. So we have had, in 2 centuries, an experience that is completely unprecedented in the rest of human history. We presume that our species, Homo sapiens sapien, although we're not so sure about the sapiens part, the wisdom part, but in any event, we are hominids without doubt, and our species has perhaps 200,000 years of life on the planet, and about 70,000 years since we all left Africa, or common ancestors left Africa to spread around the world. And for 60 of those 1,000 years, humanity was hunter and gatherers. And then came the Holocene, and agriculture was invented. And for another almost 10,000 years, people lived in the hard labor of subsistence agriculture. And then in the blink of an eye of the last 2 centuries, everything changed. And there have been some wonderful improvements. Life expectancy in 1800 was 30 years, perhaps. Child mortality, 300 or 400 per 1,000 births. 1 out of every 3, maybe in some places 1 out of every 2 children dying before their 5th birthday. We now have an average life expectancy on the planet of 70 years, and in the high-income countries, 80 years. And poverty has been left behind by most of the world, as I'll show you in just a moment. This has been a momentous period. But all curves look like this, and not all of them are good. This is an equally important curve to look at. This is the curve of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It looks just the same as the other curves because everything changed 200 years ago. What this curve shows is a simple fact. And the simple fact is that ever since James Watt's invention, and then about 80 years after that, the invention of the internal combustion engine, which meant not the age of coal, but now the age of oil. And then in the early 20th century with the invention of the gas turbine, allowing the age of natural gas as well. We have been burning so much coal, oil, and gas to fuel that 100-time rise of world output that all of that combustion, of course, is creating carbon dioxide that is emitted into the atmosphere and that we know stays up there once we put it up there. Doesn't come down with the rain. It's not acid rain. It's not sulfur oxides or nitrous oxides. The CO2 that goes up stays for hundreds or even thousands of years. So it accumulates. And as the world has grown, the carbon dioxide has accumulated as well. And we know, even if the word hasn't quite gotten to Washington and to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, that when the carbon dioxide goes up in the air, it warms the planet. And it's absolutely irrefutable science, as much as any of our science is irrefutable because it is completely interconnected with our understanding of the most basic properties of thermodynamics, the most basic properties of quantum mechanics, the most basic dynamics of the relationship of Earth and solar radiation. And so it's been known for about 150 years that as we raise the CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to create a problem. And the problem is that the Earth is going to warm. And as the Earth warms, strange to talk about tonight, but actually not even contradictory with the cold temperatures here, as I'll actually describe briefly in a moment, as the carbon dioxide rises in the atmosphere and the Earth warms, the climate becomes perturbed. We enter the Anthropocene. Humanity becomes the driver of the climate itself. Horrifying prospect, by the way, because we're not exactly up to steering all of this very well. Indeed, till today, because it is unprecedented, because it is not part of our ancient texts, it's not part of our culture, it's not part of our common knowledge, it's not part of our political system, we're in denial politically. Not most people, but most of Congress, unfortunately, and a lot of the world. And so all curves end up looking like this, both the good side and the bad side. Well, here's another curve to ponder, which is showing graphically waves of technology that followed the steam engine. It's also good news that it wasn't just the steam engine, but it was followed by rail, it was followed by the telegraph, it was followed by the internal combustion engine. In our century, it was followed by aviation, by computing starting around 1940, and now by the information revolution. So what was unleashed 200 years ago by James Watt, and I have no doubt that his machine was the single most decisive breakthrough in human economic history, it did unleash a continuing wave of technological change. Every one of those waves has carried the world to higher incomes, but also to more impact on the planet. Almost every technology, every class of technology has had a side of positive benefit, but also inadvertently a side of risk. And the point about that is that technology by itself is the necessary condition for improving the human material condition, but it is by far not the sufficient condition, because technology is always double-sided. And that's why fundamentally we're always facing a choice. And we're always fundamentally facing a moral choice, not a technological choice. There is no technological determinism. There's only technology as a tool if we choose to use it, and how we choose to use it. Now, in our generation, the curve that looks like this is information technology. And this is the curve of Moore's law, the observation that starting back in 1959, when a very clever guy named Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments figured out how to etch a transistor on a silicon crystal. Since that momentous event, the capacity to use silicon crystals to reinvent how we manage information has been the most revolutionary transformation of all of these technological changes. As Gordon Moore noted in 1965, just 6 years after the start of this, he said, my God, every year we've been able to double the density of transistors on this chip, from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. And Moore, who was then head of a new company called Intel, said this can probably go on at least another 10 years of this doubling, and that became known as Moore's law. And the fact of the matter is it's gone on not for another 10 years, but it's gone on for another 50 years since Moore talked about it, roughly at a rate of doubling every 2 years, 25 more doublings. So we've had something like 30 to 31 doublings of what's called the transistor count, the ability to put transistors onto a chip. That's the integrated circuit. And that's the information revolution. And last year, Intel put 5 billion transistors on the chip, roughly 55 years after having put 1 on the wafer. And that, of course, has led to the highest flowering of civilizational achievement imaginable. And that is that you can stream a movie on your phone. Because it's hard to think of anything beyond that, right? But that is where we have come to. We have now the capacity to transmit, to process, to store data and all information that we know by a theorem of Alan Turing, a new star of the screen, and now, fortunately, a known name once again in our world. Since Turing realized that you could make a universal machine that can read bits of zeros and ones in the 1930s, we now have that realization coming true. And we can manage information to an unprecedented extent. And if we choose to use it right, we can solve the problems of the planetary threats. We can solve the problems of poverty. If we choose to use it wrong, it's just going to be surveillance and cyber warfare and all of the dark side, because that technology lends itself to that as well, as we know. Never before has our government and our companies known exactly what we're doing, when we're doing it, and I should say, hello, NSA. They listen to all my calls, so I always like to give a little shout out. It's a risk. So again, it's a choice. It's not an inevitability. And one of the exciting things for us and for Notre Dame working in Africa and many other parts of the world, communities that were completely isolated before, within the last few years now have broadband. Now they can watch House of Cards on its premiere third season tomorrow night. That's what I'm going to be doing after my talk, probably all night. And that will be happening in villages all over the world, I'm sure, by the way. But also they can get health care, they can start businesses, they can have educational curricula. Really, the sky's the limit if we're creative. And there are now 7 billion mobile subscribers. There were about 20,000 in 1980. So this is phenomenal what can be done. The pace of growth, the pace of economic advance is absolutely unimaginable compared to past history. This is Shenzhen, China. It's the part of China in the Guangdong province, just near Hong Kong. This is the picture of this idyllic place, 1980, about 23,000 people living in farm families. This is Shenzhen now. Take a look at that, by the way. Same view. Now it's 25 million people. Makes New York look like a tiny little place. This is, for good, for bad, this is how fast economic development can go now with the power of technology. And I want to emphasize, with a great deal of improvement of living conditions possible. This is the poverty rate as measured by the World Bank, going down, down, down. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The End of Poverty, where I said it is feasible, realistic, to eliminate extreme poverty in our generation. This is true, and we are seeing before our eyes that it's true. We don't yet care enough to actually make it happen on the timetable that it could happen. But nonetheless, even with a world of neglect, the poverty rate has come down in the developing countries from around 43% in 1990 to around 15% now. And if we do care, it will come down to 0 in the next 15 years. So it's wonderful what can be done. But I'm going to turn to what we're not doing. And I want to emphasize how big the challenge is. Economic growth and poverty reduction are at grave threat because they are not sustainable the way that we're doing them. There are 3 huge challenges. First, there is growing inequality and social exclusion around the world, including in our own country. We've reached an unprecedented degree of inequality in our own society. It's never been like this. The rich are richer than anyone can imagine. They have so much wealth, they have no idea what to do with it. And a significant part of our country is struggling in poverty or near poverty at the same time. And our political system has almost shut down in terms of actually addressing this. We're phasing out government, despite all of the cries about big government and all the rest. Our discretionary government is shrinking in size, not expanding. It's shrinking dramatically. Second, there are parts of the world, and especially in tropical Africa, but in parts of Asia as well, that are trapped in high poverty, high fertility rates, rapid population growth, girls not getting to school, poor health, vulnerability to Ebola and to other epidemics. It is a cycle, a vicious cycle, that has been unrelieved and cannot be solved purely within those poverty-stricken countries, but can only be solved by a kind of global solidarity, Again, a solidarity that is absolutely as shaky as it has been in decades or generations. And third is that we have not woken up to the environmental crisis, even though we are at the very door of calamity environmentally. So in this sense, one could say the world is achieving growth, and we pat ourselves on the back, GDP growth 3%, GDP growth 5%. But what does it mean if it's growth that is excluding rather than including a great deal of society, if it's growth that leaves behind billions of people, if it's growth that threatens the very physical basis of our survival? And that's the kind of growth, unwittingly, and sometimes it seems wittingly, we actually have. This shows the rising inequality, the so-called Gini coefficient in the United States. This is the rising inequality in China. It's these huge, great societies with great economic progress are not inclusive in their performance right now. There's unrest around the world, in part because there's high youth unemployment, there's rising inequality, there's rising dissatisfaction with the economic model. And in Africa, where there has been progress, the continued poverty, the fact that only about 20% of secondary school-age girls get to secondary school. Girls are marrying young. Fertility rates remain 5, 6, or 7 in very poor households. The population continues to soar. The vulnerability continues to be extraordinarily high. Water stress, resource stress, and in an age of climate change, we can't say that we're inevitably on a path out of poverty unless we attend to these underlying, very deep, very real challenges. What the ecologists have used as the term alongside the Anthropocene is the concept of planetary boundaries. In a very important article in 2009 in Nature magazine, some of the world's leading ecologists pointed out that we are pushing to the edge, to the thresholds of 10 major planetary physical challenges, climate change being the most important, but also challenges like the acidification of oceans, which also comes from that high carbon dioxide dissolving in the ocean surface, lowering the pH, raising the acidity, disrupting the marine ecosystems, and therefore the protein chain that feeds about 25% of humanity's proteins. We're not even aware of this by and large, and yet it's approaching dire threat within a matter of a few decades, and that is the tendency that we're on. And these planetary boundaries, if one goes around the circle, include loss of biodiversity, massive pollution, the heavy aerosol loadings that are the dark clouds in Asia, the black carbon, and the massive amount of fertilizer that runs off of our farms that's poisoning the estuaries around the world. There are 130 major estuaries that have the same kind of dead zone that we have at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And that comes from the phosphorus and the nitrogen that collects on the farms, collects in the Mississippi and the Missouri, goes down to past New Orleans, out to the Gulf of Mexico. But that's happening all over the world as well. Every place I travel for the United Nations, I see crisis, and I hear about it. A year ago, I was in Sao Paulo. Interestingly, I was told a year ago there's a major drought underway. I said, oh, what's the government doing about it? They said, shh, nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? Oh, the World Cup's coming up this summer. Don't talk about it. Don't say anything before the World Cup. And then the World Cup came. They said, shh, the elections are coming up. Don't scare people. So they did nothing. And now Sao Paulo, a city of 20 million people, is about to go to water rationing. It's extraordinary, one of the world's major cities. Forest fires from drought in many parts of the world, this from Sumatra and Indonesia. Massive flooding, which is the counterpart in the wet places getting wetter and the dry places getting drier is the basic truth of how climate change affects the hydrological cycle. The Balkans had the worst floods in 500 years last spring. They've never seen anything like it in Bosnia and Serbia, Croatia. And in Japan, massive floods again. I just felt, I don't think it's me, but every place I went, disaster. But usually the disaster was there first. I showed up. But you really feel this amount of instability. California, massive drought. And you can see in these red patches around the world on this map, well, you can't see the map very clearly, these are all drought areas at the end of 2014. And look at the Middle East, filled with drought, filled with hunger, filled with war. Don't think it's a coincidence. It's not the only thing happening, but the amount of life stress in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Yemen, is enormous. 10 years ago, my wife and I went to Yemen at the invitation of the president. I came back horrified because it was clearly a country that was about to go over the edge. I went to Washington and said, Yemen's very dangerous. Yemen, who cares about Yemen? Now Yemen's fallen apart. Violence, terrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, everything. All predictable because you can see the underlying crisis. But we don't care. We don't notice. And somehow we think the drones are going to solve these problems, which they're not. They're not going to solve a single one of them. Now, I was going to say a word about how cold it is tonight and why that's global warming. And it probably is. Actually, this is a map of 2014, temperature anomaly. The blue parts of the map are where it was colder than average, and the red parts of the map are where it was warmer than average. Now, 2014 was the warmest year on planetary instrument history. But for us, it didn't feel that way, did it? So it's really interesting and probably true that while this was an extraordinarily warm year, this we all learned last year, because I am not a meteorologist, this is polar vortex. And what we're seeing is, incidentally, if you look up here, it happened again this year. Alaska in January was 40 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. 40 degrees, while we were freezing in South Bend in New York City. And what's happening is that the whole polar front is becoming unstable. The polar front is the part of the mid-latitudes where the polar cold air meets the warmer subtropical air. And it's where the jet streams form. And normally the jet streams go from west to east, carrying our weather. But now the jet streams are meandering north and south, called meridional Rossby waves. They're becoming unstable. And the theory links that actually to an overall warming planet. Because what's happening is the polar regions are warming faster than the mid-latitudes. The temperature gap between where we are and the pole is shrinking because the pole's warming even faster. And when the temperature difference is weaker, is less, then the jet stream is weaker. When the jet stream is weaker, it tends to meander farther south. And that's why it's so cold tonight. Thank you. That's as much weather forecast as I can do. But it is really true that we're destabilizing the planet, and we're destabilizing it everywhere. And what my colleagues tell me is even 1 degree C, 1 degree Celsius warming compared to the pre-industrial era, and we're just about there, is completely unprecedented for the Holocene period. So one of my colleagues is one of the world's leading climatologists, James Hansen. He says we're already passing out of the Holocene that we've known for all of civilization. The world's governments have agreed to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And Hansen says, that's crazy. 2 degrees is so unstable, we're going to see suffering all over the world. But I say, Jim, we're not even going to make 2 degrees the way we're going, as he knows very well. We're on a trajectory of 4 to 6 degrees warming this century. And that, by all accounts, is a calamity, because that means massive droughts, massive flooding, sea level rise, and huge disruption of the world food supply. That is our challenge. How are we going to take seriously the goals of economic development, but combine them with the goals of social justice, social inclusion, and environmental sanity? That's the real challenge. We know how to make an economy grow, but that's no longer the issue, especially for you students, for your generation. That's the easy part. The hard part is to do that in a way that meets true human needs, not that racks up the GDP numbers, but that carries people to better life and that keeps the planet safe. So that's what sustainable development is. Sustainable development is a framework that I really want to recommend to you. It's a concept. It's a concept that is an analytical concept as well as a normative concept. As an analytical concept, it says we have to pay attention to the interconnections of economic systems, political systems, social systems, and environmental physical systems. So we need to understand complex, interacting systems, both natural or physical and human-made. That's a different kind of discipline. My own discipline, economics, pays so little attention to the environment that it carried on for decades without noticing what was happening. And linking the physical systems, the engineered technological systems, the human and social systems is vital if we're going to understand any of these challenges, if we're going to understand crises like the Syrian crisis, or what drought means, or why there's rising inequality, or how to fight climate change. So that's the analytical side of this concept. But the normative side is something that I'm sure Notre Dame fully embraces, and that is that we need a more holistic approach to life and a more holistic approach to society. It's not good enough to talk about economic growth. If we don't have economic growth that is within a moral framework, that meets human needs, that satisfies the tests of social justice, that is inclusive, and that protects the physical world, the creation, there's no chance and no use. And we have reached the point where we can't ignore those facts anymore. We've entered the Anthropocene. We've entered a new epoch where we will create massive instability that will undercut the very basis of our well-being if we don't take a different approach. Now, the good news is that despite the world of neglect which we have, the governments of the world are sufficiently nervous that in 2012 they rightly said, in 2015, at the end of the Millennium Development Goals, we must adopt new sustainable development goals to make sustainable development the organizing principle for the coming generation. And in September of this year, there will be the world's largest gathering of heads of state in history, probably about 180 world leaders coming to the UN. You'll be happy to know, and I'm thrilled to know, that as this meeting convenes on September 25th, who will be the first speaker to the world leaders? It will be Pope Francis. He will open the gathering of this greatest assembly of world leaders in history. And he will tell the world leaders that this is the moral challenge of our time. And the world leaders, we hope, 2 days later, will adopt Sustainable Development Goals as the guideposts for how we can rethink how our economies work, what our social objectives are, what our political systems are directed at. In fact, there are 3 huge negotiations this year. It's amazing. In July, there will be a summit on the financing for sustainable development, how to make the financial system direct attention to what needs to be financed: renewable energy, low carbon energy, health and education, and stop financing the things that we should not be financing, like the Keystone Pipeline, because we don't need that heavy oil. In fact, we can't even safely use it. That's what, it's not about about 800 jobs. It's not about, it's about whether the oil sands make sense in a safe world. And the answer is no, they do not. We have more than enough coal, oil, and gas conventionally to use. We can't even use this safely. So why do we even think of a project like this? Because there's short-term money to be made by powerful interests, not because it's good for the world, not because it's safe to use. So the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals is to get this right, to give us a new language, a new framework, and a new ability to handle this, and to stop financing the bad stuff. And that's July. Then September, we'll adopt Sustainable Development Goals, and if the world does its homework this year, we will arrive in Paris, which is the final stop and maybe even the hardest of the negotiations, 23 years after signing the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We'll try to sign a real climate agreement, at least to keep the warming below the 2 degrees C that the scientists say do not go above that level, because if we do, we will imperil the world. And that will be the purpose of December. So there's a lot to do, and a lot can be done. I should just mention that part of the work we're doing at the UN is to try to show, it's very practical actually, it's not some fancy theory, it's very practical to decarbonize even a major economy like the United States. The 3 pillars of decarbonization are energy efficiency, renewable or low-carbon electricity, and electrification of vehicles. The good news I want to tell you is that we're all going to be driving Teslas in 10 years, or their equivalent, and they're going to be a lot more fun, a lot smarter. They're going to drive themselves for us anyway, so we'll be able to do our texting and drive at the same time, because we won't actually have to hold a steering wheel. And we're going to have to move to a new generation of vehicles, smart grid, smart electricity. South Bend is going to be powered by wind from the Dakotas, not by oil and hydrofracking. And New York City can be powered by another high voltage direct current line coming from hydropower in Canada and from massive amounts of offshore wind. California is on a track to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, and they got a great desert to tap for solar energy. We can do this if we choose to do it. And of course, we have the oil lobby telling us, don't do it, it's impossible. We have the Wall Street Journal making science fiction every day in the editorial page. I think, by the way, I don't know what paper you get. I somehow think that they write the editorials just for the edition they leave on my step, because I can't actually believe that they tell other people this stupidity. But I think it's just to make me mad. But maybe you see the same things I do. It's beyond, it's simply beyond acceptable. It is purely immoral. It's not a different point of view. It is a willful lying about the state of the world and the challenges we face. It has to be called out, and we have to do something about it. There we go. Now I feel better. He said so many good things, by the way, that you don't know where to start. But I love this statement from Evangelii Gaudium, because I think it's really the essence of the issue. To sustain a lifestyle which excludes others, or to sustain enthusiasm for that selfish ideal, a globalization of indifference has developed. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, and feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. I think our greatest challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is the globalization of indifference. It is so far our inability, despite having access to all the information we could ever imagine, just with a few strokes on our phones, nonetheless, with all of the ability to find solutions, with the high technology, with the breakthroughs of agronomy, biotechnology, nanotechnology, genomics, information technology, artificial intelligence. We've got what we need. We can find solutions. Our great challenge is to overcome the globalization of indifference. I have no doubt that Notre Dame will be leading the way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I talked too long, but if we have just a couple minutes for questions, I'm, of course, delighted to hear, especially from the students. So I'd love to, hear any questions or comments.
Well, I don't think I need a mic, but I'll up here anyway.
Yeah, you have a good voice. That's good.
Thank you. So, I mean, I've studied sustainable development. That is my self-designed major. So everything that you've touched upon, it's been really exciting to hear about these like interdisciplinary facets of development. So this is kind of an important question then in terms of understanding how universities and institutes kind of start to promote sustainable development. What are your thoughts on Notre Dame's failure to divest from fossil fuels?
Yeah. I wrote a piece, but I co-wrote it with one of my favorite co-authors, my daughter, who teaches at Columbia Law School. You can find it online. It was published at Huffington Post, so look up Lisa Sachs and Jeffrey Sachs Divestment. And we tried to give some ideas about divestment. And we said that every university needs to be a responsible investor. And we said to do the following. If you're holding fossil fuel companies, you must query them. And we gave a list of questions to query. First, do you believe in the 2 C upper limit on global warming? Second, will you renounce membership in any lobbying group that is resisting that or fighting against it? 3, do you have your own corporate strategy for how you're going to participate in a 2 C upper limit world? And 4, why are you still a good investment in that world? So we said, at least come back, and you must ask those questions. Every responsible investor, every university, Notre Dame, Columbia, Harvard, and so forth, you can't just say, we don't think we're going to do this. You have to have that level of responsibility. Now, what will happen is that some of the big companies, Exxon, for example, they'll give a lousy answer. And they've already given an answer. They've said, we don't believe in the 2 degrees C. We don't think it's, you know, we don't really believe that those limits are going to apply. That's a really nasty view, because not only is it irresponsible just to blow off humanity that way, they're actively promoting policies to make sure it doesn't happen. So then we said, if the companies cannot give a proper account, you must divest. And so that's our proposal, is 2 steps. If a company will be a responsible actor on the way to a decarbonized world, then it can be part of a portfolio if it also passes the good financial test, because many of these companies will be lousy investments in such a world. But at least they have to acknowledge the scientific truth, get out of these miserable Washington lobbying groups, and say that they're going to play a constructive role, and how are they going to do it. And I can tell you, our companies in the US are among the worst behaviors right now on this issue. It's even, I won't name names, which I should, but I won't, of a couple of companies that pretend or propel themselves as great environmental companies, major companies. And I asked them last fall, I shouldn't mention GE, for example. Oh, okay, but I will. GE has eco-imagination. I said, say that you're for the 2 degrees C limit. It took them 8 weeks, and then they came back, oh, it's too dangerous in Washington to say that. What does that mean? What it really means, by the way, is that they're lobbying on their taxes and all the rest, and they don't want to upset the Republican leadership. And so you have this really terrible behavior, because in Europe it's actually much better. Even I'm working with Total, working with Eni, Statoil. Major oil companies are saying, of course we believe in the 2 degrees C, and we've got to do something about it. But in the US, we're not even at that threshold level. So I want to know Chevron, Peabody, ExxonMobil, come on. If you're not for it, out of the portfolio. And absolutely, we have to say to all of the universities, there's no business holding this unless we get decent behavior by these companies. And by the way, this is what Harvard did very well 40 years ago. It asked the tobacco companies about lung cancer and their policies. It got lousy answers. It divested. The principle is there. It's not a matter of, oh, we don't do that. But when Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, was asked about this last year, she said, no, no, the endowment is for maximizing value for our academic programs. Really a bad answer. Wrong in history, wrong in principle, wrong in Harvard's tradition, and wrong for Harvard. And so we need to do better. And I'd be happy if you'd communicate that to your administration, too.
We're trying. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was interested that you said the globalization of indifference is the biggest problem that we face. So I hadn't really rank ordered all the problems that we face. So that one wouldn't have been my first, but now I'll ponder it. But if I had to name my first, I would have said money in politics. Mm-hmm. And when I think about myself, not as a scholar, but as a citizen, and how I could spend my time publicly in service, I'm often choosing between fighting the good fight in terms of climate change awareness, or is it maybe better to think of root causes, which is something like Citizens United? And I kind of wonder if you, in your professional dealings, make those same kind of calculations. Like, are we spending all this time raising awareness or getting agreements when if we don't overturn these terrible Supreme Court decisions, all that energy could be wasted, because the fundamental problem is that we will never be able to get our political system on board if we don't get money out of politics. Yeah.
It's a great question. The fact of the matter is we have to be really busy doing a lot of things over the next few years. So we have to be attuned to the politics. We have to be attuned to the substantive issues of decarbonization. We have to be recognizing that we're not the only player in this globally also. We are less than 5% of the world's population, and we are one of 193 countries. And so there's a whole world out there that, by the way, is quite worried. That's good in one sense, that when I speak in the General Assembly at the United Nations to dozens of ambassadors, you just get the sense the whole world is worried that, my God, what are we doing? It's really unstable, because everyone's feeling this instability right now and these tensions. And what that means is that we also can make transnational linkages. Not everything will depend on the US being out in front. We may just have to drag the US along as other countries come into this. Now, what's also true is that China is a decisive actor in this. China is probably about the same size as the US economy now in absolute terms. Per person, 1/4. But in absolute terms, maybe even a little bit bigger depending on whose numbers you look at. It's a much bigger polluter than the United States now. It's a much bigger greenhouse gas emitter. The truth is, even if the US was saintly, did everything perfect, if China continues the way it is, the world's also not going to make it. And so we have to talk to our Chinese colleagues all the time also. They've been saying, and it's interesting, what economic development has been about for 200 years is really something not simple, but it could be put this way. Britain started the Industrial Revolution. Then the US and Germany came behind. Then Japan came behind. And then all the rest of the world, everybody's trying to run towards the one in front of them, saying, I want to be like them, because if you're poor, you're also weak, you're vulnerable, you can get attacked, you can get taken over, all sorts of reasons you want to catch up. So everybody follows the country ahead of them. And China's desperately trying to catch up with the West, also because they feel that the last 150 years wasn't so great being poor in a Western-led world from the Opium Wars on. They had to fight a war. You know, Britain attacked them to make opium trade free. I mean, it's unbelievable how cynical and dark that was, and that's a core part of China's legacy and mentality. We'll never let that happen again. We can never be vulnerable again. So what China's saying is, yeah, it's dangerous, but our main goal is to catch up with the one in front. Why should we slow down? We have to catch up. And so what China's been saying for years is, if you would move in a different direction, we'll go too, but we're not going to start it unless we see the US doing it. So we're going to all have to make that change together. So there's a big global element to this as well as the national element. But when it comes to the US, you're absolutely right in the diagnosis. Our political system is broken. We have one of the most corrupt political systems in the world. We certainly have the biggest money system in the whole world. The next election is going to be a $10 billion election. The Koch brothers, just the two of them, have said they're putting in $900 million. And since we can't believe anything they say, maybe that's going to be $1.5 billion, which they also wouldn't notice because they got $100 billion. So it's really dangerous. And we judge candidates by how much money they raise. We're crazy, by the way. Oh, we really like Hillary. She's a great fundraiser. It scares the wits out of me. Anyone who's a good fundraiser is bought. Period. I don't want good fundraisers. What I really dream of, truly, if someone here will start it, please, I dream of candidates that say, I'm not taking anything. My opponent's on the take. I'm not. Okay, I'm taking $99 maximum, but no more, because I want to pay the bus fare for my campaign. I'm not running ads. I'm working on free social media. I want the journalists to put me on as an odd curiosity on their shows. as the weird candidate who has no money but in some insane view thinks they have a chance, and do that enough times that I become a serious candidate, and leverage the fact that I'm not on the take. Pardon me? We should get someone who could really win. Seriously. No, but get a serious, real candidate and do it. And this is the way out in the end. It is, in my view, a little bit, it's almost a Martin Luther King Jr. theory of campaigns. If they've got the weapons, the key is you don't hit back. It's not force for force. It's the nonviolent approach. So it's the non-money approach to big money. You're not going to get them to make a new law. Forget it. Forget it. This is the incumbent's paradise. Washington is corrupt, but they got it made. And the country runs for rich people. They give enough to poor people so that there isn't an complete explosion, but there are lots of little explosions around now because they don't have it very well calibrated. So we need candidates that absolutely will say, we're going for the human cause. When, how, US history shows it takes about 10 years for a great social movement to come about. I'd say civil rights movement had its magnificent momentum from 1954 to 1968. And the progressive era, the populist progressive era from the 1880s up through when Teddy Roosevelt became president. And the Great Society came after 10 or 15 years of hard work, and a moment came. And so we've got to build. It's not going to happen from one day to the next, but we're on the wrong track right now. I'm a lapsed Democrat. I don't believe in it. And I used to be a member of the Democratic Party. The core of it is corrupt. The core of the Republican Party, in my view, more corrupt. So I don't want to be misunderstood. The oil industry owns all the Republican Party and only half the Democratic Party. But Bill Clinton made an alliance with Wall Street in 1992, and we're still not out of it. And that was very damaging. And we have not gotten out of it to this moment. And so the politics are broken in this country, but we're a free country still, and the politics can be fixed. Thanks. Thank you.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt the question and answer and discussion, but I'm very happy instead to be able to invite you to continue this just a little way across the way at Carol Sander Hall in the Remick Commons. That's where the Institute for Educational Initiatives is, and there's a reception to which you are all welcome, and Professor Sachs will be there with us. Please thank our guests for being here at Notre Dame.